This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Philip Taubman, a lecturer at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation, who was previously a reporter and editor at the New York Times for 30 years. Roger and Philip discuss his new authoritative biography of George Shultz, who served as Secretary of State under President Ronald Reagan and helped to bring about the end of the Cold War. Philip's new book is titled In the Nation's Service: The Life and Times of George P. Shultz.
Philip Taubman, welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Great to have you on, and you're known for your affiliation at Stanford, the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and your years at the New York Times as a reporter and an editor. But today we're here because you are the author of In the Nation's Service: The Life and Times of George P. Shultz, of course, the famed Secretary of State during the Reagan administration. And Phil, you were the one who was given the opportunity to write the authorized biography. How did that come about?
Well, it's actually a fun story, a very Stanford-esque story. I was working on a book that Shultz was part of. The book was called The Partnership: Five Cold Warriors and Their Quest to Ban the Bomb, and the others being Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, and Bill Perry. And at a luncheon before the big football game between Stanford and Cal, Schultz invites me over to a corner and says, would you be interested in doing my biography? And I said, yes, I'm flattered that you would ask, but I've first got to finish this book, so it's going to take a while. And he said, well, as an inducement, I'll give you exclusive access to my papers, which are stored at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And so over the next 18 months or so, as I was finishing the other book, I went into the archive and found some astonishingly interesting material, which we can come back and talk about. And so after about 18 months, he had been very patient. I went to him and I said, George, I'd love to do your biography, and thank you for inviting me, but we have to have a clear understanding. It's your life, but it's my book.
You note that in the beginning of your book here. That's a great line.
He graciously and immediately accepted that, and I'm pleased to report that over the ensuing 8 to 10 years that I was working on the project, he never once tried to alter any editorial content. In fact, he didn't even see the book until very late. It was just the last year before he died. So it is an authorized biography in that sense, but it's an independent biography.
So much there. I'm kind of curious to follow up on. Of course, we'll go through the life and times of George Shultz. You said that between the time he offered the opportunity to you and the time you accepted, you marched on down to the Hoover Institution archives and I guess pulled various files from George P. Shultz's papers, and you found astonishingly interesting things. What's top of mind? What was the one or two things you saw? You're like, wow, this is juicy and interesting.
Well, I think the number one item by far, and anyone who reads the book will see how important it was to doing the book, was a diary that was kept by Raymond Seitz, his executive assistant, during Schultz's first two and a half, 3 years as Secretary of State. Seitz went on to be ambassador to Great Britain, was a very experienced, seasoned diplomat, and a shrewd observer of Washington and power in Washington. And Schultz had total trust in Seitz. So he would report back to Seitz every day on everything that he had done. Seitz was witness to some of what happened every day. But if Schultz went over to the White House or the Defense Department or wherever, he would come back and recount what had happened. And Seitz kept careful notes, turned it into a very elegantly written diary that was then typed up every day or every few days by his secretary. And lo and behold, there it was at the Hoover Institution, all 800 single-space type pages.
Wow, what an insight into the day-to-day life of a Secretary of State.
And it's full of revelations about uh, triumphs and setbacks. And, it was very difficult for Schultz during his first year as a Secretary of State. We can talk about
Well,
that.
I definitely want to go into that, but I want to build up to the man. He's obviously known as the Secretary of State, and you reveal so much about that time. But of course, by the time he was Secretary of State and was confirmed and entered the role, this was somebody who was a seasoned veteran of Washington, served in multiple roles in the Nixon administration, and had always had policy focus. Let's devote a few minutes to George Shultz, Nixon administration, and kind of the building of what became the Statesman. What stands out to you? And I note that reading your book, you obviously admire and think there's a lot of there to celebrate about George Shultz, but you also point out areas where perhaps he fell short of maybe his own standards. The amount of time he stayed in the Nixon administration, for example, you point out. Give us the wave tops of George Shultz's career prior to becoming Secretary of State, and what you think are the kind of the critical experiences and positions and moments.
So if you look at the Nixon years, where he held 3 cabinet positions, Secretary of Labor, the inaugural director of the newly created Office of Management and Budget, and then Treasury Secretary. I think as Labor Secretary, he accomplished a great deal that history hasn't focused on, because his greatest triumphs were as Secretary of State. But when you go back and look at that period in the Nixon administration, George Shultz was a key figure in the desegregation of Southern school systems. This happened when Nixon appointed him to a task force to accomplish that goal that Vice President Agnew was the head of. Agnew was not really keen to get involved in that issue, so he kind of exited, and Schultz ended up running the task force. And it was highly successful. When you look at the data, at the beginning of their work, less than 25% of urban school systems in the South were desegregated. By the time they were done, over 75% were. So it's a wonderful story of Schultz as a problem solver, which is really, I think, in many ways, his defining characteristic. Don't get distracted by ideology. Don't get distracted by partisanship. Just figure out how to solve a problem.
But he was conservative. I mean, you note that as well, that this was somebody who identifies as a Republican, was a conservative. You talk about his rearing, from in New York City, and then ultimately, kind of his education. I mean, this is somebody who was a free marketer, conservative, and felt that those ideas won out, whether it was ideological or just reason.
Indeed. In his early years during the Great Depression, he was a young man. He watched what was going on in the country. And many people were, of course, celebrating Franklin Roosevelt's efforts to revive the American economy. Schultz was not impressed. He looked at what was going on and saw that there were still tremendous economic disturbances around the country. And at that point, sort of concluded that government intervention in the economy was not the way to go. And that was the foundation of what became a firm belief in free market, and led to a very close relationship, with some of the great, free market economists of the era.
And that kind of from Princeton to University of Chicago. I mean, the education kind of all put him on that trajectory. Another facet before we move to other points of government service, he of course served in World War II.
He did, and
identify himself as George P. Schultz, Marine.
Indeed,
how does that piece fit into the making of the man, Phil?
Well, when you look back at his service as Secretary of State, you can see the import of his experiences in the Marine Corps. He was dispatched to the Pacific Theater, was involved in at least one combat moment when his unit was occupying a small island that had just been vacated by the Japanese. and they came under air attack by Japanese warplanes, and 6 or 7 of his fellow Marines were killed in that incident. That left a major impact on him about, you have to be judicious in the use of force. It's necessary, especially in the interest of advancing American diplomacy at times, so-called coercive diplomacy, but you have to be mindful that putting troops in harm's way is a major decision. He also always remembered the instructions of his Marine drill sergeant when he was learning how to use a rifle, and the drill sergeant put it in his hands and said, "Never aim this at anyone unless you're willing to pull the trigger." And Schultz always, throughout the rest of his life, talked about the danger of phony threats, that when you are threatening the use of American power, you have to be ready to execute.
Yeah, I heard him reference that, near the end of his life as a guiding principle, not only for a Marine, but as you note, Phil, diplomats and policymakers included.
Exactly.
The rhetoric they use and the approach to policy. Let's stick just before we get to the Reagan administration. Obviously, being a Secretary of Treasury is a highly consequential role, not only for domestic policy, but also for foreign policy. And his training as an economist made him not only well suited for labor secretary and leading what, as a first you note, head of OMB, but also for Treasury Secretary. Take a minute to talk about that role, obviously during a pretty edgy time during the Nixon administration, and how that also prepared him to be a Secretary of State, because that sort of training, of course, Jim Baker would repeat that feat. But my sense is that George Shultz was the first to make that move from Treasury to Secretary of State.
That's correct. So the Treasury years were good years and bad years for Schultz. So if you look back at the economic record, he was vehemently opposed to wage and price controls, which Nixon put in place not once but twice. And indeed, the second time, that was the ostensible reason that Schultz resigned as Treasury Secretary. He also played an absolutely critical role in a big Nixon international economic decision, which was to rearrange exchange rates between currencies, take that whole system off the basis on the dollar and the value of America's gold reserves, which was the system established at Bretton Woods agreement just as World War II was ending. And Nixon and Schultz agreed that that was no longer sustainable. So
Off
even
the gold standard, now the current approach we have, which is the currency.
Yeah, the same approach today. When you're traveling overseas, your value of the dollar is variable against other currencies. And that was really George Shultz's action and advice as Treasury Secretary. Where he got into trouble was he got drawn into a kind of what I would describe as a sideshow of Watergate. He famously stood up to the White House when John Dean, the White House counsel, demanded that the IRS, which was under Schultz's jurisdiction at Treasury, investigate Nixon's so-called enemies list. He resisted that, but he did not resist when the White House came back and said, we want the IRS to investigate Larry O'Brien, the chair of the Democratic Party, for potential tax fraud. And that was a moment, you alluded to it earlier, where I think Schultz did not live up to his own values.
Did you interview Secretary Schultz at various points as you conducted the research and put the book together? Kind of, where are the points that you really, I need clarification, maybe a sensitive one like the case you just raised during his time as Treasury Secretary, or some other point in the story? Was there that moment you're like, I just need Schultz's view on this?
Quite a few times, and what was great about his cooperation, which was it was essentially unlimited. Anytime I asked to interview him, a time would be set, and that indeed was one awkward occasion where I had to go and grill him about something that he didn't really want to remember, much less talk about. And in the book, one will find his comments trying to explain what he was doing and rationalize it, justify it. And it was really the old Washington argument that, if I'm not there, the situation will get even worse. But, some of the big questions I had about his role in winding down the Cold War were clarified at these interviews.
Let's move to George Shultz as Secretary of State. And here I want to have you outline the relationship between George Shultz and Ronald Reagan. The reality, this was Ronald Reagan's second Secretary of State, and where they knew each other and clearly interacted, this wasn't one of Reagan's closest relationships. You have Ed Meese, Mike Deaver, Dick Allen, other players that were prominent in the foreign policy space. To the extent that George Shultz was involved in Reagan campaigns, it was really tied to the economic side, best I can tell. Take a minute, Phil, to describe how this marriage between, President and Secretary of State really came about.
No, you're exactly right. The prior relationship revolved around economic policy issues, and Shultz had served as chair of an economic policy advisory board during the Reagan campaign in 1980. Alexander Haig was appointed Secretary of State, flamed out after a year. Shultz was president of the Bechtel Corporation, and Reagan decided to invite him to be Secretary of State. They didn't really have a close relationship, and Shultz didn't really know what Ronald Reagan wanted to do about the Cold War. He had, like everyone else during that period, had heard a lot of belligerent rhetoric from Reagan about the Soviet Union, evil empire, and so on. He had watched approvingly of the big Reagan buildup in the Defense Department. But when Shultz came to Washington as secretary in 1982, he really didn't know whether that was the beginning and end of Reagan's views about the Soviet Union, more confrontational, really, than prior presidents in some ways, or whether, like Shultz himself, Reagan, in his heart of hearts, wanted to wind down the Cold War. And it took many months, indeed several years, before the two men figured out that they actually agreed on this fundamental issue. Part of the problem was that Shultz had a hard time getting in to see Reagan one-on-one. He was blocked by more hardline advisors around Reagan, like Cap Weinberger at Defense and Bill Casey at CIA and Bill Clark, the National Security Advisor. And what you can see in that diary that was maintained by Ray Seitz is that over and over again, Shultz would go over to the White House hoping to have the kind of heart-to-heart conversation with the president about U.S.-Soviet relations, and would arrive only to find many of the people who opposed his views, Shultz's views, in the room. They're very frustrating to Shultz, so much so that he threatened to resign a number of times. So it was a slowly developing relationship, and it was abetted at a crucial time by Nancy Reagan.
All right, well, I want to get to the relationship George Shultz had with Nancy Reagan, but let's stick with the three other names you just threw out there: Weinberger, Casey, and Clark, and all these people had pre-existing relationships, some going back decades. Weinberger, of course, served in Reagan's cabinet when he was governor in California. Interesting link between Weinberger and Shultz. Of course, they were both at Bechtel together. Weinberger being the general counsel before he became Reagan's Secretary of Defense. Casey chaired his campaign in 1980. And then Clark also, Judge Clark was on his team as governor, and one of his closest friends and confidant. So, did Shultz have any allies coming into this, and who recommended Shultz in the first place? Right? If the insiders were suspect of his views.
Well, he actually, when Reagan was elected and was selecting his cabinet, there was a debate about who should be Secretary of State. A couple of prominent people quietly chimed in saying Shultz would not be an appropriate choice because his background was in economic policy and wasn't really steeped in U.S.-Soviet relations and nuclear arms control issues. Two of those people were Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. And the people around Reagan, favored Haig, as actually did Nixon. So,
was it Kissinger or Nixon aide, right?
Yeah, right. Shultz had a very fraught relationship with Weinberger. You kind of alluded to their past history. They had worked together in the Nixon administration. When Shultz became director of OMB, Cap Weinberger was appointed as his deputy. And so they were working together in the Nixon administration. Then at Bechtel, where Shultz was the more senior figure, Weinberger was the general counsel. And then Weinberger becomes defense secretary, although he wanted, I found in the records, actually to be Secretary of State. And some of the people around Reagan thought he would be an excellent Secretary of State. Casey had he had a prior relationship with Shultz. He had been head of the SEC and then Undersecretary of State back during the Nixon years. And they had sort of bonded on some travel together to the Soviet Union. But ultimately, their views about the Soviet Union were not congruent.
Well, Casey carried out the whole covert operation and was, as hawkish as they get in terms of confrontation and rolling back, correct?
Yeah. So even though there was an interesting rapport between Casey and Shultz when they got started in the Reagan administration, it fell apart very quickly. And Clark, just didn't agree with what Shultz wanted to do. So, this was this phalanx of opponents. On Shultz's side turned out to be Nancy Reagan, pivotally, also Jim Baker, who was the chief of staff at the first term for Reagan, and Mike Deaver, who was deputy chief of staff and very, very close to Nancy Reagan.
That whole framework, Phil, that you've just outlined, that Shultz had this outlook and wanted to engage the Soviets and figure out how to wind down, your words, the Cold War. And it took some time to get President Reagan there. And you had these other actors who didn't quite see it that way. They're the kind of hardened Cold Warriors. Suggests that George Shultz arrived in the role of Secretary of State with a somehow decided view on what needed to happen. But as you've noted, he didn't really have kind of that foreign policy experience, hadn't been dealing with the diplomats throughout his career, was far more on the economic side. When did George Shultz kind of develop that outlook?
So, and this is where you see a kind of common view between Shultz and Reagan. Okay. And the starting point for it, in my view, is that they were both outsiders in Washington. Certainly Reagan was. He had been governor of California, had really very little to do with Washington before he became president. Shultz had worked in the Nixon administration, but he was not invested in Cold War doctrines. And so the two shared a couple of observations in common, which proved to be absolutely critical. One, which was not, I think, widely understood at the time, was that the Soviet Union was a failing state because its economy was in a stupor. The centrally planned Soviet economy, consumers had access to almost nothing. When I got there as a New York Times reporter in 1985, the thing that shocked me most and told me most was when I began to go out to the home of Russians for dinner. And what was the centerpiece of their dinner for what a person they thought was an important, American journalist? Boiled potatoes. Because they didn't have access to meat. Shultz had picked up what was going on a couple of trips to the Soviet Union during the Nixon administration. He had gone over there. His wife, who was a nurse earlier in her life, had gone to a hospital and come back to report to George that the Soviet hospital she visited was atrocious. There were no sanitary procedures. It was primitive. George went with a Soviet guide to a Black Sea resort. And where did the guide take him? Took him to an old Tsarist palace that had been restored and made the argument to Shultz that, look, we can do beautiful things and important things here. Not all our money is spent on defense. And that sort of registered with him. Huh? Isn't that interesting? So when Shultz became Secretary of State, he had a kind of innate experience-based view that the Soviet Union was a failing state. Reagan had the same view, not from any personal experience, but because I think Reagan had read a lot about the Soviet Union.
And his advisors told him as part of the, National Security Decision Directive, in the NSC, kind of imposing the defense buildup in part was to, further bankrupt the Soviets, right?
Yeah. Right, exactly. And the Strategic Defense Initiative was a factor in that. So they shared that in common. They also shared in common a deep-seated worry about nuclear war. And that drove them. And then lastly, and this was not clear for several years, they both shared a desire to negotiate with the Kremlin. I mean, it would have been hard to know that during Reagan's first years because it was a time when all the headlines were about the hot rhetoric about the Soviet Union and the American military buildup. But once the two men realized that they shared all these views in common, that's when their friendship clicked.
Let's focus on that last of the three, because this gets to where I think there's some debate around President Reagan and his approach to the Soviet Union and George Shultz's role. Of course, President Reagan wanted to negotiate with the Soviets. It needed to be done from his judgment. He said this throughout, from a position of strength. You've set up that when George Shultz arrived and was trying to kind of get to this point, he was essentially being blocked in physically and policy wise from realizing that. But did George Shultz share the approach that the time had to be right? You had, of course, the Soviet leaders who were dying one at a time before you got to Gorbachev, but also the United States wasn't in a strong enough position in 1981, 82, 83, even if you would have had someone to negotiate with, both militarily and economically, from, I think, a Reagan standpoint. So did George Shultz ideally want to begin this process in 1981 or 2, or did he kind of agree that this is part of the plan, but we got to wait for our spot and it's not going to happen until midway through, or the end of the first term, beginning of the second term?
Well, I think the record is clear, at least the record that I had access to, which is he believed firmly in the necessity of a military buildup. But he also believed from day one that we needed to open negotiating channels with the Kremlin and try to resolve some of the differences. And in fact, Bob Woodward told me just recently that he sat next to Obi Shultz, George's wife, within the first year of Shultz's service as Secretary of State, and asked her, what is your husband hoping to accomplish as Secretary of State? Her answer was, he wants to end the Cold War. And so I think he came to Washington with that desire, and he tried to implement it immediately. You look back at his abortive efforts to get negotiations going in the first few years. So he was not, his attitude was, we can do this simultaneously. We can build up our military. We can put the Kremlin on the defensive, but we should start negotiating with them.
And go ahead.
I think the core argument of my book about Schultz and Reagan and the end of the Cold War is that Reagan came in and in his core, he wanted to end the Cold War. He set the stage for that with his rhetoric and his military buildup, but he didn't know how to execute the diplomatic side. And his other advisors weren't interested in diplomacy particularly. And so it took George Shultz, in effect, to allow Reagan to be Reagan. And he, in a very telling way, he made a comment about that phrase, which was a common phrase in Washington at the time.
Let Reagan be Reagan. That's what the right said anytime, somebody intervened, whether Deaver wasn't going conservative enough for the Republicans, or Jim Baker, for example.
Exactly. And so it was the rallying cry of people who let Reagan be Reagan, let him be tough with the Kremlin. Schultz's definition of let Reagan be Reagan was let him act on his inner impulses to be a peacemaker. But I think absent George Shultz as Secretary of State, the end of the Cold War, it probably wouldn't have happened the way it happened, and certainly not as quickly as it happened.
And clearly that's a thrust of your argument and your takeaway from going deep in the archives of understanding the man and what the record shows. I want to, for a moment, just pick up on a nuance in terms of what Bob Woodward shared with you about George Shultz's wife saying he wanted to end the Cold War. Of course, for Ronald Reagan, it was ending the Cold War through winning the Cold War. And that's what he emphasized in the years prior to becoming president and through it. And that's certainly where many of the quote unquote hawkish advisors around him wanted to do. Now, of course, what does winning look like is all in the kind of the eye of the person putting the win together, right? And George Shultz clearly had an approach, but just wanted Phil clarify, was it ending or winning, or was winning the way to end it?
Well, it was both, it turned out. The West won the Cold War. Ultimately, now we're sort of back in a new war with Russia in Ukraine. But at the time, it was both. But I think the key to understanding that is bringing the winning strategy, if you want to call it that, to a series of negotiations and agreements that sealed the Western victory, in effect.
Yes.
And that's really what Schultz's role was.
I'm just picking up on the nuance of the word ending. You have a wonderful quote from Mikhail Gorbachev in the preface. And again, it's the same language. I'll read it. Without Reagan, the Cold War would not have ended. But without Schultz, Reagan would not have ended the Cold War. And it makes sense that would be the language of Mikhail Gorbachev. He would not have said that Reagan won the Cold War. Obviously, he was a key player, and it was his vantage point negotiated outcome. But of course, Reagan famously said, "We win, they lose." And peace through strength it was all about ending the Cold War in a way that it was the kind of peace that preserved freedom, the kind of peace that would preserve prosperity, and that wouldn't accommodate the Soviet Union as it was. George Shultz bought into that entirely, no?
No, of course he did. And let's give credit where credit is due. George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker were present when the Cold War actually ended. And they handled that very skillfully.
Let's talk about the design, the diplomacy that Schultz wanted to put in place and ultimately was able to do so. What were the most controversial elements? Where did he have to bring in his partner in crime, Nancy Reagan, to help get there? And ultimately, he discovered in President Reagan that Reagan was seeking the opportunity to sit down and engage in kind of summitry and never really had the opportunity.
Right, exactly. So the crucial moment, looking back at history, was the breakthrough was thanks to Mother Nature and Nancy Reagan. Mother Nature provided a blizzard in February of '83 that shut down Washington. I lived there at the time. The snow was 3 feet deep. The Reagans were going to go up to Camp David for the weekend. They couldn't get there. So Nancy Reagan invites the Schultzes over for dinner. And it was that dinner where Schultz, for the first time, realized that Reagan had never met, as he said, a big-time communist leader.
Big-time communist leader, huh?
Yeah, that was George's phrase. Schultz had just come back from China, where he had met with Deng Xiaoping. And as the dinner unfolded, it was clear that, Reagan wanted to engage with these communist leaders. And so they cooked up a very, modest effort at that dinner that would involve Reagan meeting for the first time substantively with the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Dobrynin. By the way, that meeting, which took place, within a week of the dinner, was opposed by Bill Clark. He thought it was a huge mistake. And out of that dinner flowed, again, a modest set of diplomacy that led to a small breakthrough with the release in Moscow of a group of Pentecostals who had been holed up in the American embassy because they were going to be thrown.
Reagan prioritized from the beginning. And if you look at Reagan's diary, right, he was advocating for them in his first communication to Brezhnev. I mean, it was always top of mind for him,
right,
in light of these, the people whose freedom was denied.
Yeah, and so again, I think this underscores Schultz's core, essential, pivotal role. Reagan had wanted to do that for a long time. Nothing had happened. Schultz comes, they meet Dobrynin. Schultz and Dobrynin agree, let's see if we can make this happen. Reagan makes an absolutely critical promise, which he lived up to, which is, if you let them out, I won't crow about it. And he didn't. And they were ultimately allowed not only to return to Soviet society without being arrested, but ultimately to emigrate. And so that's in a thumbnail example of the difference that Schultz made. Prior to that, the president hadn't even met with the Soviet ambassador. So that dinner was kind of a breakthrough moment. And then slowly but surely, Schultz would kind of prevail over the opponents and put together a diplomatic strategy to deal with the Kremlin. But as you said, there was really nobody to talk to for a while. Brezhnev was aged, then he died. Andropov comes in. He was suffering from kidney failure right from the beginning. He died. Chernenko comes in. Chernenko was almost a corpse when he took office. And so it wasn't until March of '85 when Gorbachev, different generation, different thinking about the Soviet Union, takes power, that there's actually someone to talk to in Moscow. And don't forget, Gorbachev comes in just after Reagan is reelected to a second term. And that gave Reagan, I think, a runway to operate on in his second term that had not been easy for him to try to use in his first term.
I want to talk about the moments where it had to be challenging for George Shultz leading the diplomatic effort, given Reagan's own sensibilities of what he was and was not willing to give up. I'm referring to Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, Star Wars. But before we go there, talk about Nancy Reagan and how her role, not just inviting them for dinner that, evening in 1983 when there's a blizzard, they don't go to Camp David, but her aspirations for President Reagan and the kind of the spirit, between the two, the common spirit between the two.
She wanted her husband to go down in history as a peacemaker, which in fact he did. But I think if it hadn't been for her, that might not have happened, because she and Schultz were really critical to that happening. She was concerned about the depiction of her husband in the first term because of the advice she felt, the bad advice she felt he was getting from Weinberger, Clark, Casey, and others. And she thought her husband was in danger of having a presidency that would be recalled by historians as a failed presidency in terms of international progress. So she, as I say, the blizzard was an opportunity that, drove up, but she was ready to seize it. And inviting them over that night, that was a calculated decision, because she liked Schultz. She didn't know him that well yet, but she saw in him someone she felt she could trust. She openly said she didn't trust Bill Clark. And in fact, 6 months after this dinner, Clark's out. He's moved over to become Interior Secretary. That happened because of Nancy Reagan. There's no question about that. So she played an absolutely pivotal role. She once told Brian Mulroney, the Canadian Prime Minister, that I have to protect Ronnie from being Ronnie. And by that, she meant that he didn't like confrontations. He was loyal to his advisors like Clark and Weinberger and Meese and others who had served with him in Sacramento. But she felt her duty was to make sure that his interests were served, her husband's interests.
And there was no better ally or player in the cabinet for Nancy Reagan than George Shultz.
And let's be frank about it. I mean, Shultz understood this and I think cultivated her. They kind of love to banter. The Reagans hosted a lot of their elegant state dinners, and Nancy took to making sure that George Shultz sat next to whomever the Hollywood starlet was at the dinner. and in fact, one of Shultz's greatest, fondest memories was dancing, at these dinners, with these starlets. So, and at one point when her husband was ill and couldn't attend a dinner at the last minute, Nancy danced with George Shultz, and she sent him an inscribed photo of the two of them dancing, and the phrasing was something like, "At last, my turn."
So a trusting and a warm relationship that created openings for the diplomatic approach that George Shultz wanted to take. But at the end of the day, it had to be President Reagan's. And talk about one of those pivotal moments where they're making progress and of the type of arms negotiations that President Reagan always wanted, which was reduction. It was had to be a departure from the approach in détente, where you were having treaties designed to prevent an increase in nuclear weapons. This was about arms reductions treaties. And that, of course, was the INF Treaty. And President Reagan got very close to doing it, but ultimately SDI was the stumbling block. And then they subsequently got the INF Treaty done. But where was George Shultz on that? And did he share the view of President Reagan, both in terms of arms control, arms reduction, and the need to hold on to SDI?
Well, he certainly shared the view that we needed to go from limiting nuclear arms growth to actually reducing the number of nuclear weapons. When it came to the INF, these intermediate range nuclear forces, that was actually a pivotal moment where you can see the combination of strength and diplomacy. The United States was insistent on placing so-called Pershing intermediate range missiles in West Germany to counter the Soviet missiles of the similar kind in western parts of the Soviet Union. It was a struggle to get those deployed into West Germany. It was done ultimately, I think, a courageous act by Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor at the time. There was fierce public opposition to that. But it was the positioning of those missiles in West Germany that was a pivotal turning point. So you've got there the demonstration of Western willpower to confront the Soviet Union. Then you roll in the SDI initiative. Shultz's position on SDI, when he first heard about it, which, by the way, was at the last minute, just a few days before.
It was a White House concoction that the cabinet officials were not aware of.
Right, exactly. He was appalled. He thought this technology is fanciful. This stuff can't be built in our lifetimes. And furthermore, it's going to upend the whole nuclear deterrence policy. If there's actually a shield against Soviet missiles attacking the United States, then the Russians will fear a first strike by the Americans, and so on and so on. But once Reagan gave the speech announcing it, he got in line, supported it, and I think used it effectively, as did Reagan, as a bargaining chip with the Kremlin, except in the end, they weren't willing to bargain it. And so
That's
here
what
we
I'm talking about. And Reagan,
I know. Right.
Yeah, Reagan's not willing to give it away. What is Shultz's reaction to all this?
Yeah, so here, to me, this is a kind of it's still a bit of a mystery to me. So they're using it as leverage. It's pretty effective leverage. Before Gorbachev goes to the SNAP summit in Reykjavik, he meets with the Politburo. Those records have now been, unveiled. And you see in the minutes of those meetings that Gorbachev very candidly says to his fellow Soviet leaders, we can't compete in defense spending with the United States. It's going to upend our economy. So he goes to Reykjavik wanting to make a deal. And Reagan and Schultz come to Reykjavik not really knowing exactly what to expect, because there had been very little, if any, preparation for this summit meeting. And lo and behold, they find themselves around a table in a little cottage by the sea, in Reykjavik, talking not only about reducing nuclear weapons, but eliminating them, abolishing them. Astounding, right?
All on the table.
All on the table, and this close to an agreement. But it fell apart because Reagan didn't want to yield on Star Wars. Gorbachev made a proposal which, in retrospect, probably was a compromise that could have been accepted, which was, okay, 10 years of research on the technologies in, quote, in the laboratory, unquote. The technologies were so futuristic, they probably could have spent 10 years working on them in the laboratory effectively. But Reagan said no. He handed Schultz a note at the table when he was declining to accept this proposal and said, am I doing the right thing? And George wrote back, yes, I agree. So the summit fell apart. But in fact, it was a pivotal summit because it laid the groundwork, as you suggested, for ultimately the treaty to eliminate the intermediate range forces in the European theater.
One more facet of George Shultz's diplomacy and President Reagan's outlook and the foreign policy of the day. Of course, Reagan's closest partner in the Cold War in terms of other world leaders was Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher, of course, wasn't enthusiastic initially about the approach to Gorbachev. Talk to us about Schultz and Thatcher and Schultz in the UK and how he managed that peace, because it was a complication. You talk about the people inside the White House and the administration who didn't share George Shultz's view, but Thatcher was a challenge as well.
She wasn't, and she wasn't in the sense, remember, Gorbachev went to London before he became Soviet leader. He was already a Politburo member. And during that visit, she announced, I think we can do business with him.
Yes, right.
Which was an important moment. And she was the first to recognize that there could be a sea change in the Soviet leadership. But once Gorbachev came in power and Reagan started to negotiate with him about arms reductions, she was concerned they were going too far, too fast. And in fact, after Reykjavik, she caught the first plane to Washington. And as Schultz described it, handbagged him. Remember, Margaret Thatcher would always carry a handbag on her arm. And she was outraged that they had actually talked about abolishing nuclear weapons. So yeah, she was, I think, a brake to some extent on what Reagan wanted to do at that point. But ultimately, she didn't prevent him from winding down the Cold War. And I think in the end, she supported it.
Let's go to elements of George Shultz's legacy and perhaps what has stayed today or should stay today. I'll highlight a few and love to get your take on them, and then we'll hit on the lightning round. Again, we're with Philip Taubman, author of The Life and Times of George P. Shultz and the Nation's Service, out, available. Go on Amazon. You could find it, published by Stanford University Press. In terms of legacy, what was the metaphor that George Shultz used for the gardening metaphor for diplomacy, and kind of maybe capturing his approach, an approach he thinks others should and others have employed?
Schultz had a couple of phrases that he loved to cite, and one of them was about the importance of being a gardener in managing diplomacy. And by that, he meant that you can't wait, between meetings to conduct diplomatic business, that you have to take care of the small things in order to get the big things accomplished. And the analogy was, if you don't weed the garden, it's going to get overgrown with weeds. And so he was very conscientious and adept at that. The other thing that he believed very strongly, that he put in play constantly, the phrase, trust is the coin of the realm. And by that, he meant, if you're going to get anything done in diplomacy or really in life, you've got to work in a trusting relationship with people. And you can't see a better example of that than the trusting relationship that he built with Ronald Reagan, which was really the basis for everything else. And he didn't have that trusting relationship for the first few years. And then the trusting relationship that he built with Edward Shevardnadze, his Kremlin counterpart after Gorbachev took office, and the relationship that he built himself with Gorbachev. These were four men who really wound down the Cold War. And it was the trust that developed between the four of them that I think Shultz was the primary proponent of, that made a world of difference.
And of course, George Shultz continued to write about that. Trust is the coin of the realm. In fact, it's one of the last opinion piece I think he wrote, maybe the last one, appearing maybe in the Wall Street Journal or other. He was a century old, perhaps, or close to it when he penned it. What was he writing about towards the end of his life, reflecting on that?
I mean, he did. He wrote basically a little pamphlet that I don't have the exact title, but it was essentially reflecting on 100 years. He was about to turn 100. And he talked about what he thought were the most important characteristics that leaders needed to have. And one of them was, building trust with your counterparts. The other, was cultivating the diplomatic garden. An emphasis on problem solving, setting aside ideology, setting aside partisanship, taking problems apart and trying to solve them. He had a great phrase for that, which sounds kind of corny, but when you actually stop and look at it, it's pretty profound, and it worked very effectively, which is, if you bring people together and they're arguing over principle, they'll never come to agreement. If you bring them together and you ask them to solve a problem, they'll work together to try to solve it.
Let's move to our lightning round. Thank you, Phil Taubman, and your work on George Shultz, the Authorized Biography, although it had total independence, as you noted at the outset.
Please.
In the nation's service. Let's, as we ask all our guests here, get your take on our lightning round questions. What is your favorite book on President Reagan, speech by President Reagan, and quote President Reagan? Give us all three, two, or just one. What do you have?
Well, I think speech, I would point to the Westminster speech, which he delivered to the British Parliament. That sort of summarized his take on the Soviet Union. And if you go back and look at it closely, you can see all the elements of his policy, including the diplomatic element, which was kind of dormant at that period and was kind of activated by Shultz. The most memorable phrase was "tear down the wall, Mr. Gorbachev." And that was a dramatic moment. Books by Reagan, I think, his kind of quasi-autobiography, is a very interesting look at the man. And I highly recommend to people who haven't read it, his own writings. Ronald Reagan spent a lot of time writing. There was a perception of him at the time that he was kind of not illiterate, but this was not a literary man. And when you go back and look, he actually was very thoughtful and spent a lot of time recording his thoughts in longhand. Those books, which I read carefully, are very interesting. And his diary, by the way, his presidential diary, which I cite in the book quite a few times. You go back and you look at crucial moments in his presidency through the eyes of George Shultz, which is what I do in the book, and you see where Reagan chimes in along the way, supporting Shultz quietly behind the scenes.
Phil Taubman, thank you so much for being on the show. Congratulations on this great accomplishment in the nation's service, the life and times of George P. Shultz.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.